Good evening, everyone. I think we'll kick off this evening's webinar on forage crop planning. My name is Mary McEvoy and I'm joined tonight by Harley Brown-Keech and Claire Bailey Archibald. So just to begin, I'm going to share a few slides before I hand over to Harley and then on to Claire for tonight's webinar. My name is Mary McEvoy. I'm based in the Horse and Jockey in Tipperary, working with Germinal for the last 12 years. And before we begin tonight's webinar, I just want to give you a brief introduction as to who Germinal are and what we're about for those of you who might not be familiar with the company. So Germinal is a leading grass and forage seed specialist with a long-standing legacy of innovation in grassland production. We began in 1825 in Belfast and our head office is back in Belfast today. Germinal Horizon is our dedicated research and development entity that delivers research-driven innovations to improve performance for farmers on an ongoing basis. Our groundbreaking breeding technologies deliver proven performance while providing environmental benefits in the face of growing climate challenges. And these include our market-leading Aber high sugar grasses, which most of our UK audience will be familiar with, but might be somewhat new to our Irish audience. So our high sugar grasses are designed to improve protein utilisation by the ruminant and reduce nitrogen excretion. Some of the varieties you will be familiar with, I'm sure, that deliver in terms of the Aber high sugar grasses include Abergain, Aberban and Aberspay, to name but a few. We also have our double root white clover, Aberlasting, which is a cross between a Caucasian clover and a white clover, which has both rhizomes and stolons, which bring both increased cold tolerance and drought tolerance. And on top of that, we have some of our other ever reliable both white and red clovers, including Aberherald, Aberswan, and Aberclaret. The objective of tonight's webinar is to give you information on various species, which will allow you to make the right decisions for your particular farm to offset deficits or to fill forage gaps, depending on when they might occur, be it during the midsummer period or later into the autumn or early winter period. It's been a very challenging spring so far. And, when we're talking to both an Irish and UK audience, I think there's been a huge differences in terms of what both sides of the water have experienced in terms of the weather to date. But by all accounts, no matter where you are across the two countries this evening, it is quite warm. So just in terms of what's coming up, we're going to talk about grasses, we're going to talk about clovers and herbs, and then move on to brassicas. And we're going to have a question and answer session then to close up this evening as well. So first up tonight, we have Harley Brown-Keech. He's one of our UK area sales managers covering the Midlands and North Wales. Harley grew up on a mixed beef and sheep farm before going on to study at Harper Adams, and he's been a member of our team at Germinal here for over 3 years. So tonight, Harley will discuss different grass options, what they can offer, and how they may fit into your system, and the benefits and drawbacks, I suppose, of each as well. He'll discuss the role of clover and herbs and where they can bring benefits to your overall feed system. We are also joined tonight by Claire Bailey Archibald, who will discuss brassicas. Claire is originally from Australia, so just in case any of our UK audience get a little bit concerned by the strange Irish accent, she actually has an Australian accent. She's our area sales manager in the northeast of Ireland. Claire is a plant science graduate and brings a wealth of knowledge to Germinal in terms of her experience both in the drier parts of Australia and her experience on her mixed tillage farm here in County Meath. So Claire will cover brassicas and the various options that are available and what they may offer in terms of forage options for your system, in terms of what might suit at different times of the season to offset deficits that do occur. We are going to ask you to submit your questions through our question and answer function on the webinar tonight, and we will get to as many questions as we can throughout the evening. Any questions we don't cover this evening, we will follow up when we're sending out the email with the presentation over the next day or two. Please do get as many questions in as you possibly can through the questions and answer function. And as I say, we will deal with as many as we possibly can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Harley and he will introduce his topic and speak to you for about the next 20 minutes or so. We'll take a couple of questions after Harley's talk when Claire is setting up, and I will take more questions after Claire's session. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mary. Hopefully you can all see the slide on the screen there. So as Mary said, I'm going to be looking at a few grass options, legume and herb options available to help you in your forage crop planning. And I'm going to be starting with the main building block of a good lay, being the perennial ryegrass. A medium to long-term grass variety. They are quick to establish, but there are other ryegrasses varieties which will establish quicker. Perennial ryegrass varieties will become active during the growing season when the soil temperature reaches 6 degrees and climbing. Perennial ryegrasses have great quality across the abergrass varieties on the market. And when looking at mixtures, we do need to be assessing varieties on the recommended grass and clover list or the PPI in Ireland, and with particular focus on the D value and ME. And then we want to filter down to the conservation and grazing performance, depending on what you intend to use the lay for. Perennial ryegrass is a perfect example of a grass suited to a rotational grazing with the three-leaf principle on the grazing platform or for conservation cutting. Although we see at times, unfortunately, perennial ryegrass shutting down its production as soil moisture deficits arise and air temperatures climb during the season. And we typically call this a perennial ryegrass's mid-season lull in production. However, your perennial ryegrass is also very good at bouncing back from the drought stress periods once soil moisture does return. And when we're assessing perennial ryegrass varieties, they are split into diploids and tetraploid categories. But we use the diploids for ground cover and poaching resistance in grazing lays. And if you look at out-and-out grazing lays, you generally see these being all diploid varieties. Tetraploids we push for cutting due to the upright growth characteristics of the plant, and it's designed for defoliation. Your dual-purpose mixtures, we'll be looking at 50-50 splits of diploids and tetraploids to accommodate the cut and graze scenarios on the farm. And for those looking to overseed, we'll be using all tetraploids, as these are a slightly larger seed due to the number of chromosomes in the plant, which gives it a greater strike rate. Moving on from perennial ryegrass, we now look at Italian ryegrass. This is a short lifespan crop of 2 years with rapid establishment. Germination taking between 7 and 10 days in the right conditions, and the rapid growth habit works well with red clovers in silage mixtures to enhance protein content. We generally see the use of Italian ryegrass in cutting rather than grazing lays due to the high yield of the crop. Compared to perennial ryegrass, your Italian ryegrass will begin growing when soil temperatures are around 3 to 4 degrees, giving us extended growth at the shoulders of the seasons. And we see good use of Italian ryegrass sown in between maize rows or after maize for an early cut of silage before going back into maize. The reason for using Italian ryegrasses in the cutting systems is they can and will run to head mid-season quickly, especially during dry conditions like we're all experiencing. Once the seed head has emerged, the D value begins to drop quickly, and we're losing around half a unit of D value a day. So we want to be cutting the lay before the seed head emerges. And the plants also have a very open growth habit and fewer tillers than other grasses, but overall a very good option for growers short of forage during the season or wanting to buffer those supplies. Next, we have hybrid ryegrasses, and these are a cross between a perennial ryegrass and an Italian ryegrass. So we're increasing the longevity of the Italian ryegrass element to 4 years. And again, using these products for large quantities of high quality silage during peak grass growth. And the quality is coming in from the perennial ryegrass element. Much of the principles around cutting and not grazing are the same as the Italian ryegrass we've just discussed on the previous slide. Another important grass in our armoury for the changing climate are festiloliums. And the first point to help understand festiloliums is to understand their parentage. Once you have identified the parentage, we can begin to place the variety into mixtures most suited to its use. So festiloliums can be a cross of a ryegrass, be that Italian or perennial, and a fescue. But now there are around 300 fescue types to choose from. So if you're in any doubt of the festilolium and identifying which one can be of benefit, speak to your seed supplier or the breeder. And these products are being bred for production, but also abiotic stress tolerances, be that drought, extreme temperatures, or soil variances. Abernèche, one of Germinal's 2 festiloliums, is an Italian ryegrass cross fescue. So we have the longevity of the fescue, pushing the Italian ryegrass to 4 years, and the increase in quality. But we retain the yield performance of the Italian. But if we then compare this to Aberroot, our other festilolium, which is a perennial ryegrass cross of fescue, we see the quality and longevity of the perennial ryegrass, but we have introduced greater rooting mass of the plant from the Atlas fescue to around 3 times more. Now, typical yields for festiloliums sit anywhere between 12 to 18 tonne of dry matter a hectare, and this range, like all grass yields, will be affected by all the usual factors, temperature, moisture, soil health, and nutrition. So moving away from ryegrasses, we do have a number of other very good varieties to help tackle the challenges you face on farm. Firstly, we have Timothy, a persistent crop which has good quality, and these late heading varieties cutting just as the seed ripens provides nutritious forage as hay. And the yield typically around 10 tonnes of dry matter a hectare. Most of the yield is likely to be in the spring, with growth slower as the season progresses. And we're typically including in mixtures around half a kilo to a kilo an acre, as there are circa 2.5 million seeds per kilo on Timothy. All of the varieties we're discussing tonight have small seeds and limited energy reserves to germinate and throw up those first leaves to capture sunlight. So please don't be tempted to bury the seed and find moisture, as this will lead to the failure of the crop. We would typically include this variety in mixtures where we see heavier soil types, as it has a shallower rooting system. Excuse me. Then we have cocksfoot, a versatile grass, but it does need hard grazing to stop that clumping. If the plant is left ungrazed, it becomes unpalatable due to the sharp silica hairs on the leaf. So the animal goes to bite or wrap its tongue around the plant, feels the sharpness on the leaf, and then rejects it. And this is then exacerbated as the season progresses, and we end up recreationally topping to reset the plant. These varieties are typically coming to head between May and September and yield around 10 to 12 tonne of dry matter a hectare. Cocksfoot plants at a young leafy stage are almost as nutritionally dense as perennial ryegrass, but one big benefit to cocksfoot is its drought tolerance during the season. So compared to a perennial ryegrass, cocksfoot can see you another week to 10 days into a drought, but will take another week to 10 days to come out of the drought once that moisture returns. We'd be typically including around a kilo an acre in mixtures of cocksfoot or less, but if we see areas with severe drought for growers, we would need to be increasing the inclusion to around 6 to 8 kilos an acre to make a meaningful difference. So lastly, on the grass front, we have fescues, and there are over 300 species within the festuca family, from specific lawn types to varieties that can be 2 meters tall. And the main agricultural fescues, be that meadow fescue, and these can be slower to establish than perennial ryegrass and cocksfoot, or tall fescue, which is taller and coarser than the meadow fescue. And we have hard fescue, sheep's fescue, be that lower yielding, but it has reasonable quality and can withstand heavy grazing, or soft leaf tall fescue, or strong creeping red fescue. And several of these fescues are used in the amenity or equestrian world. Your tall fescue will yield around 10 to 12 tonne of dry matter a hectare, with meadow fescue slightly behind this around 10 tonne of dry matter a hectare. Your tall fescue would be being used for deep roots, good persistence, dealing with occasional waterlogging and heavy grazing. And then we use meadow fescue for heavier soil types and wetter environments because it's got good early spring growth and winter hardiness. Here we can see on the slide a yield profile of our multi-species trial work of our Germinal Horizon Wiltshire site. This trial has been running since 2019, comparing yield, quality, and persistency over several mixtures, variations, and 2 different fertilizer regimes. The Germinal Horizon research work found that the right multi-species mix can outperform a perennial ryegrass monoculture by around 25%. But more doesn't always translate to more yield, and we can tip the balance in production when reviewing the diverse mix on the right-hand side there, which included 16 species. Moving on to the legumes now, and first we can look at white clover. Well, what is white clover? It's a stoloniferous plant, spreading roots across the soil surface, creating those adventitious roots where the stolon touches the ground. The plant spreads and forms a stolon network of colonial daughter plants. So these provide the sites for new leaves, roots, and flowers. And the stolon is a store of carbohydrates and proteins and provides the ability for the plant to overwinter and regenerate in the spring. We're typically grown within a mixed sward for grazing, as it can withstand that grazing tear, if well established. And white clover is categorized into 3 leaf sizes, and it's often those marked differences in their leaf and stolon characteristics that help to determine their agronomic performance. So white clover leaf size is a small, under 700 mil. You'd be using those in the intensive grazing scenarios. Then you've got medium, say 701 to 1,000 millimeters for sheep and beef grazing. And then we have large, over 1,000 mil. They're dairy cattle grazing or for silage scenarios. But as with all legumes we're going to discuss here tonight, they require warm soil, 9 degrees and climbing, to begin that forage production and the biological nitrogen fixation process. And to aid this establishment process, your clover will require good soil indices, in particular phosphate for shoot development, seedling vigor, biological nitrogen fixation production, and the rhizobia symbiosis. And depending on your soil indices, you may require applications of phosphate and potash at drilling. And if you're in any doubt on those, you can source those from RB209. And another brilliant benefit to the legume is the biodiversity element, which we can't put a price on for invertebrates, birds, bees, and soil health. And we've seen ample evidence from our Germinal Horizon Wiltshire work that the grass and clover swards at 150 kilos of nitrogen have been shown to achieve the same dry matter yield per hectare as the perennial ryegrass only sward with 250 kilos of nitrogen, around 13 tonne of dry matter a hectare. Another great forage legume is red clover. We would want to graze this lightly in the autumn, in the year of establishment, particularly if there is a problem with annual weeds, or top or harvest if conditions allow to remove those annual weeds. We really don't want to be going into winter with too much growth, which will be susceptible to winter frosts. So as the crown of the red clover is above ground, damage must be avoided, and crown survival is the key to persistency. So don't cut it too low and avoid travelling with heavy machinery when it's wet. We'll be looking around 4 cuts per annum at sort of 6 to 8 week intervals on those good sites, with a cutting height again of 6 to 7 centimetres. So we can mow and leave it in the swath rather than spread it out, and we're going to dry down to 25 to 35% dry matter, which should be achieved within, say, 24 to 48 hours, but that may be quicker in weather like we're experiencing. Because excess wilting leads, unfortunately, to leaf shatter and lower feed value, but also more difficult consolidation in the pit. Fourth cut can be challenging for growers from a wilting point of view, so we may at that point have to ted out if not getting a good weather window. Zero grazing or a light graze actually could be an option. We do, during the year, need to let red clover flower at least once. When you choose to do this, doesn't matter, but the process allows a plant to put energy back into the roots to help survive the winter. So Project Germinal we're involved in, along with IBERS, studied the optimum cutting growth stage, and the project found the optimum time for yield and quality is the early flower bud stage, but not when it is in flower. Your yield increases as the plant matures, but once it is flowering, the ME and protein of a red clover and ryegrass sward will decline with increasing maturity. So harvesting it at the correct growth stage will produce higher value forage. Then going after the conservation cuts, we could do another light graze in the autumn for that regrowth to prevent winter rotting and protect the crown, again, which is important for that winter survival, but also spring growth in the following year. And lastly, on red clover, we need a break 5 years between red clover crops to help reduce the sclerotinia and stem eelworm disease and pest pressures. Another important perennial herbage legume is birchfoot trefoil, with well-developed taproots with lateral roots near the soil surface. It's a highly palatable species, but unfortunately it does not fare well with competition or intensive grazing. But a great benefit of the birchfoot trefoil is the condensed tannins in the plant, which help with reducing bloat in the stock by preventing methanogenesis in the rumen. And then we're moving on to the herbs. And I was starting with chicory, a moderately persistent crop, which has good protein levels at circa 16% and rising. A great product in dry scenarios with its extensive taproot, scavenging moisture and nutrients other grass and legumes can't access. There is evidence that the diverse nature of the leaf and higher grazing heights can help reduce worm burden in stock. The plant can be difficult to manage once it goes past the young leafy stage on the slide there. And animals don't naturally strip leaves from stalks, and the plant can be trampled, allowing water down the hollow stem and then unfortunately rotting it from the inside out. We would advise, though, to remove chicory from any silage layers due to the potential baling of lignified stem, which doesn't ensile well, is then rejected by the stock, or it could puncture the plastic bales. You can overseed chicory into layers to increase contribution of the species, typically around 1 kilo or less in a mix. And yields are harder to predict, with varying inclusion rates in layers. So pure stands of chicory could achieve anywhere between sort of 15 to 18 tonne of dry matter a hectare. Although chicory can go through a bitter period in its growth stages, and stock will need holding on the lay to ensure they consume the plant. And once adjusted to the variable forage options, you shouldn't see any other issues with intake. And then last, and by no means least, is plantain. And this species has a coarse root structure, with medium rooting depth, and again, moderate persistency of 3 to 5 years. A suitable option to include in perennial ryegrass and white clover lays, as the planting is akin to the perennial ryegrass growth. And for anyone looking to include herbs into a perennial ryegrass and white clover lay, a planting is a very good starting point to begin your journey on multi-species. So typically you would include around 1 kilo or less in the mixture. And again, this herb is high in protein content, naturally like the chicory. And the species are a good foundation for homegrown protein. And those that use chicory and or plantain in lays for finishing stock see huge daily live weight gain benefits. But there are other benefits of plantain is the diuretic effect the plant has on the animals in the dilution of the nitrogen concentration in the urine of the animal. There are several other, smaller herbs and legumes which could be used on farm. But if you need any further advice, please don't hesitate to contact your local Germinal rep or use our Knowledge Hub on the Germinal's website for further information. Or more importantly, please do ask a question in the Q&A function tonight. Before I finish and hand over to Claire, I wanted to highlight Germinal's Climate Smart Mixture range. So what you need to look for are answers that enable you to be profitable, produce food, and reduce your emissions and carbon footprint. And this range, at its heart, is the ABBA high sugar grasses that Mary discussed at the beginning. And these are the building block for the different categories to help tackle the challenges you as farmers face. But again, should you need any help with the mixture ranges, please don't hesitate to get in contact. Thank you.
Thanks, Harley. We're just going to take 1 or 2 questions there for you, if that's okay. So Harley, the first question in there, is there a sweet spot with the number of species in a mixed sward or mixed species lay?
Yes, I think there can be. As we see from the Germinal Horizon Wiltshire work, going over to 16 species or more did tip the balance in terms of production and the yield contribution we saw from individual varieties. A good starting point would be sort of 2 grasses, 2 herbs and 2 legumes, much as our ABBA multi-species grazing mixtures are. We've seen them provide very good performance and longevity and persistency over time. Another caveat with that, and I'm not sure about the Irish market, but obviously sometimes here with the herbal lays and multi-species, we do have government requirements on the number of varieties we put in the lay. But the design of those from our Climate Smart Restore section is very much about meeting the scheme requirement, but keeping that productivity as high as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, I think it's something similar here in terms of any of the research that's done here. It seems to be 2 grasses, 2 herbs, and 2 legumes, which seem to be giving the best results on a fairly consistent basis. Just another question on a similar front, Harley. With red clover, is that 5-year break necessary? And this is possibly coming maybe from, we've only begun really using red clover to any great extent here in Ireland over the last 3 or 4 years on the back of a government grant. And I know there's a lot of farmers probably at this stage thinking of, having to sow it down again after 4 years. The persistency of the red clover is kind of dwindling out of the sward. So is that break necessary?
Yes, is a short answer. If we run into issues with sclerotinia or stem earworm, unfortunately, when we see clover crashes, you are looking to push that break to 7 to 10 years. It's one of those prevention is better than cure. You need to treat it like an accountant would and sort of stop the crop after 5 years. Give it that break to reduce the disease and pest pressure, because if you don't, unfortunately, there is nothing other than extending that rotational break to that 7 to 10 years, which really doesn't help with that homegrown protein.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So Claire, we're just going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Mary. As Mary said earlier, my name is Claire, and this evening I'll be running through a bit about brassicas, how they fit into the year, crop selections, which varieties Germinal has to offer to the market, and at the end we're going to touch on a bit about feeding out. The story here isn't going into the depths of the agronomic, it's more what options you have, because the agronomics themselves is a whole nother tale. First, before we get into it, we just want to set the scene a little bit. Grass and brassica production is what you can see here. So basically the pale green bars are a basically growth curve of perennial ryegrass, which Harley was talking about earlier. Around 6 degrees, our perennial ryegrass starts to kick off. So you can see in the first half of the year that the growth is slower, and as we get more heat, she kicks off, peaks in May, and comes down as the weather starts to cool off towards the end of the year. And that leaves us with forage gaps potentially. So what can we do about forage gaps? You can either buy in feed, you can try and make an excess of silage, or you could consider brassicas in the system. From my perspective, always self-sufficiency is king, and trying to, keep it in-house is definitely a productive thing to do if you have the land available. And it's just nice there that you see you can have forage available from August all the way through to February, depending on which varieties you pick. So variety selection is what we're going to touch on in the next few slides. You really want to pick the best brassica for your needs. There are a few different options, and always remembering that the best part of the nutrients are in the leaf. The highest yielding crops are not always the best. It's bigger isn't always better. It's all about quality and utilization. This is more for the GB guys. Tall varieties that are used for game cover, which are at more risk for lodging, are not necessarily, not necessarily, they're actually not really suitable for forage at all. So when you're looking through a product list, it's important to make sure that you're looking at forage varieties, not game cover varieties, so you don't become unstuck. Nutrient management is important for brassicas. It's a crop that you're investing in to gain yield out of the end, to make sure that you can feed your livestock. So you need to feed them accordingly. Brassicas are hungry, and we will send out the link to the nutrient guidelines for GB and Island with the extra information at the end of the webinar. It's just to make sure that you've done all the basics, got a soil test, address your lime issues, and make sure you feed the crop accordingly. So starting off with Maris kestrel, which is a kale, we would sow that between May and June at about 3 kilos to the acre. We're looking to utilize that between November and February. It's got a great leaf to stem ratio, and we would say about 20 weeks from sowing to utilization. And if you're broadcasting that seed rather than using a precision drill, you'd want to be going at about 4 kilos to the acre. Swedes are a very useful tool. They've got a lot going for them with the above ground biomass. So we would sow them between May and June at 1 kilo to the acre. So you can imagine that calibrating is extremely important. The bulb itself yields about 9 tons of dry matter per hectare. And in trial work from 2018 to 2019, the longleaf stem retention added about 2 to 4 tons of dry matter per hectare. So that's the plant just literally holding on to its leaves. It's great that they sit above the ground. The stock have access to the majority of the fodder that is available, unlike if you're utilizing, say, a fodder beet that has a lot of the biomass under the ground, which always makes it tricky. Traditionally, Swedes have been precision drilled with graded seed. So it's important that you get that right. And one particular attribute of Triumph is its early vigor. It's a New Zealand variety that is highly suitable for our conditions. Hybrid brassicas add flexibility. We have Red Start for the market, so we would sow that between April and August at around 4 kilos to the acre. Now, Red Start is great because it is flexible, so you could sow it earlier in the year and potentially get 2 grazings. So it just depends how you want it to fit into your system. So a hybrid is a cross between a kale and a rape, and say if you wanted to use it as, say, one of its strengths would be it can be drilled early and used as a break crop before an autumn reseed, giving you 2 opportunities to control weeds, and which is good. Sometimes you have tricky weeds that you just can't get. You need to have a break crop to get them. And it also offers a break in pest cycles for things like leather jackets. Or it can be drilled later in the year for an autumn winter grazing, ready for a spring reseed. So we'd say about 90 days to maturity, and a very flexible option, very, very popular in the system. Forage rape, we offer Stego, so we would be looking at sowing that between July and August. It's very popular in tillage systems. So, after your winter wheat, potentially after your winter barley, in particular, it's fast to establish, and it does allow for some flexibility in that you can kind of sneak it past the end of August. But there's a caveat to that, as there is a caveat to most things. It's important to remember that you're not growing this from a cover crop perspective. You're growing this from a biomass production to feed livestock. So the later it's pushed out into the year, potentially the less amount of growth that plant will have. So it's always to your advantage to try and turn it around as quickly as possible in the best conditions as possible. But it is very quick to establish. We've grown it here at home before, and she jumps out of the ground. Leafy turnip, we have Avalon. We sow that between April and September at about 2 to 3 kilos to the acre, looking to utilize that between July and January. It is very similar to forage rape, so it's very much popular in the tillage system and is also fast to establish and has the same kind of credentials that you could push it out if you needed to, but making sure that really earlier is better with anything that you're trying to get production out of. This here is a product selector. So I'm not going to go through all the depths of this because it's lots of writing on the screen, but we will send this out with a link. But it just might help you kind of break it down, look at what you want, the timings of when you want your forage available, and then do you want to be able to have a second regraze, say with something like Red Start, or are you just happy to clean it out and move on? So the next step, the next piece of this puzzle is feeding advice. So it's very important with brassicas. They are a completely different animal to grass, that we consider a period of adaptation. Livestock need about 7 to 10 days to adjust to the diet because, you're giving them something that is very low in fiber and completely different to what they usually eat. So we would recommend that you have a long, narrow break, as much as you can for a feed face, recognizing that you generally use a wire with cattle, but say sheep might be block grazed. So, you've got to do what fits your system. Importantly, it's lactating dairy cows. As a part of the diet, we would recommend brassicas stayed around the 25 to 30% so that you don't end up with milk taint, because that would be extremely disappointing. And from an Irish perspective, under the GAP regulations, we are required to have a run back area. So we need, say we're offering 70% brassica, we need to have a 30% run back. So that's stubble or grass, somewhere for livestock to go lay down and rest, cattle to chew their cud, that sort of thing. Fiber is extremely important in the diet. As I said before, they're highly digestible. So we need to be offering straw, hay, or silage, and it needs to be at 30% of the diet or thereabouts. It's to allow, just to slow everything down in the system, to allow for adequate processing through the gut. So we say 30% fiber, 70% brassica. And just the picture here is great because this guy or person, actually, I'm not sure which, went and they sowed their brassica, and before it came up, they went and laid out their bales. So they're just, one of the things if you're going to put in brassicas is planning is really, really important. So you want to kind of have that all done so you just make your life easier. And also in the winter when it's wet, you're kind of considering soil health, you're keeping large machinery out of the field, and you're just able to go in and change the wire, or you go in and open your bales as you need them. You're not trying to get in and out every day with the tractor. This picture is just a great example of your double wire. It's generally used with cattle, just saves your hide. If your first wire goes down, you've got a second wire backup. And also, yourself, when you're shifting wires and you haven't got a backup, you'd probably get a breakout. And it just keeps it neat. The cattle are standing on the stubble, which is a dry part of the field. You just come and take your wire away, and it makes for excellent utilization and very little hassle. Minerals. Brassicas have lots of good points, but one of the things they're challenged by is minerals. And it's important that when you're creating your plan to have brassicas, that you talk to the vet or an animal health specialist about ensuring that you've got a pathway forward to make sure none of your livestock gets sick. So there's a couple of different options. You can do bolus, you can do licks, but you need to look at what's best for you in your system and, do the cost benefit on everything like that. So I'm going to summarize for both Harley and myself. So from a forage options for grass, herbs, and legumes, you want to you want to have a plan. Select varieties that are suited to the challenges that you face. You've got drier country. Are you looking for more legumes? Are you looking to reduce nitrogen? Utilize your legumes and herbs for quality production. They're not just there to look pretty. They do bring protein. They bring nitrogen fixation, and they've been shown in research to be extremely beneficial in your system. Keep it simple. 6 species, 2 grasses, 2 legumes, 2 herbs is a great place to start. More isn't always more. And utilize varieties off the recommended list. That's really important. Every now and then you might come across a variety and you're on a farming forum and they say, oh, this variety is spectacular and it does all of this for me. But in our climate or in your area, you've got to make sure that the varieties have been through rigorous testing, and that's what seed providers like us do. We make sure that the varieties we sell behave as they should in the field for you to make sure you get what you need. From a brassica point of view, you want to plan the winter feedstocks. On a year like this, you're probably sitting there in January going, or February, thinking, geez, it's so wet. What am I going to be able to do this year? And now we've come into a heat wave. So you can't plan for everything, but you can have definitely a baseline plan, an assessment of how much feed you have on board. And, are you going to have a shortfall? And choose the right brassica for the job. Do you want to graze twice? Do you just want something like Maris, or are you in a tillage system and would a Stego or an Avalon, which is a leafy turnip or a forage rape, would that work better for you? Keep it simple, be organized, and make sure you put your bales out. Give yourself the best fighting chance to get the best value out of the crop that you're growing. And any homegrown feed is going to be better value to you than something that is bought in. So although it does cost money to put a brassica in the ground, the reward is there if you've gone through the process and taken your time to work through it and make sure you have everything you need. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire. I suppose a couple of questions that have come in. The first one there, if it stays dry, and I suppose it's probably dry across both countries at the minute, but is it a good time to be sowing brassica?
Well, I guess it depends like which variety you're choosing. So if you're if you were looking at the Maris Kestrel, it's probably getting to the later end of the stick. So I might move on to something like Red Start. But like when you're sowing anything, if you sow it into bone dry ground, the seed's going to sit there and wait for rain. So it's like anything. You want to have some timing to get a little bit of rainfall, get a bit of moisture, so that when you've done everything off, you've rolled it, you put all your bales out. Ideally, you would get rain, otherwise seed will just sit there.
Okay, so I suppose essentially what you're saying is once it stays dry, the seed won't germinate, but once the rain comes, it could germinate. So maybe what you would end up running into a problem is if it got dry a second time after rain comes.
Yeah. You can have a wet drought essentially. It's had a little bit of rain, but not enough to do anything for you.
Okay. Another question there, Claire, just for yourself as well, from someone who is considering sowing a brassica in the next 2 to 3 weeks for winter grazing with cattle. What's their best option?
The next 2 or 3 weeks, I'd probably be looking at Red Start. Like we're getting into prime Red Start country, Red Start time, and it does offer you a little bit of flexibility. You've got 90 days until till grazing, and then you could get in and you could give another pick. It's probably getting a bit late for that, but basically I would go with Red Start, and then once you get to the tail end of August, I would probably switch over to Stego or leafy turnip like Avalon.
Okay, perfect. Claire, I'm going to just give you a breather there. Harley, I'm going to come back bring you back in there for a couple of questions. Harley, I'm going to throw kind of 2 questions here together. I suppose one is for high quality silage. What's my best option? Aiming for a first cut in mid-May. And there's another question there about the impact of red clover on silage quality. So maybe you could just answer the 2 of those combined.
Yeah, certainly. To be honest, I would go the red clover silage. We have a climate smart, clean, multi-cut red clover system with 3 kilos of abaclaret in there and 9 kilos of perennial ryegrass, which works very well together. On the quality point of view, a very good question. We see huge increases in protein content with the inclusion of the red clover. on the assumption that we have enough in the ley to give that contribution, but also that we're ensiling the product well. We're not wilting it too hard. We're not bashing the crop about, and we are taking that leaf into the clamp. But also, alongside those legumes being included, we're also reducing the artificial nitrogen requirement as the season progresses, because the legume is doing the work for you, and you've paid to put it in and let it do that work. But another great benefit to the red clover is something called the polyphenol oxidase. So polyphenol oxidase are exactly like what happens when you cut an apple in half and it goes brown. As the leaf of the red clover is ingested or ensiled, there's an oxidization of those polyphenol compounds. And to cut a long sort of scientific journey short, we effectively end up with quinones, and the quinones interact with the protein of the red clover, and basically prevent some rumen degradation, allowing that protein to pass into the hindgut of the animal for further breakdown, which effectively gives us better daily live weight gain or milk production.
Okay, very good. For fields prone to waterlogging, Harley, another question there. Only really accessible from late spring to early autumn. What's the best option?
So probably important to note at this point, like drought resistance and drought tolerance, nothing unfortunately is drought resistant after 6 weeks of no moisture. Depending on
I'd say that's more waterlogging, so that's more flood tolerance this person's asking for.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is, much like flooding, plants being submerged underwater for small periods of time will sort of come back. But if you're providing anaerobic conditions for 6 weeks of waterlogging, there's a very different scenario to face. I'd be looking to include things in there, maybe some deeper rooting varieties like a chicory and a plantain, but also some cockswoods and timothies as well, just to provide that resilience in the system to help you try and alleviate some of the pressures, depending on the flooding scenario that specific scenario is under.
Okay. Claire, a question for you there. What brassica variety would you recommend for finishing lambs in the late summer?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I guess it all depends on the availability of your sowing window. So, if you're aiming for late summer, say the leafy turnip has the opportunity to be sown earlier in the year and be utilized towards the summer. And I can't do the maths in my head on the Maris kestrel and the sowing, and then it's 20 weeks to maturity. So it just depends on what your window is at the early end of the year. And say Avalon would be a good option there.
Yeah, very good. Red Start would probably be quite commonly used for that when it's early
Yes.
sown. Obviously,
Yes,
if you can sow
of
it
course,
early,
yeah.
you'll get multiple grazings off the Red Start. But when would you want to be sown that? Probably April to get that multiple grazing?
Yeah, I would think
Red
so.
Start?
Definitely April. Yeah,
Okay.
provided you get the window. Wouldn't happen this year, I don't think.
Claire, any soil types that you would avoid growing brassicas on?
Yeah, really wet, heavy soil types is just going to make your life harder at the feeding out period because you'll be out wintering them, and you just it just is challenging to kind of keep stock on very, very wet, heavy soil, and the compaction after that is a challenge. So you'd be looking towards your drier fields that have respectable trafficability even on a bad year.
Okay. It's probably one for you, Harley, but I think both of you would be able to answer it. What's the best machinery to use to cultivate ploughed land and leave a nice even field?
Do you want to take that, Harley?
It really depends on the soil type and the conditions you face. If you try to take a power harrow into ploughed land today, you're effectively rearranging cobbles potentially. There's going to be a timing element there to the soil structure.
Yeah.
What you're looking to achieve, and I appreciate it's a bit of a politician's answer, you're aiming to achieve that sort of fine, firm seed bed. How you achieve that with the kit you have available in the shed or the contractor availability to come at the right time to do it is unfortunately one of those sort of how long is a bit of string questions. But the aim is to get that fine, firm seed bed.
Yeah, I find that when we plow here, we have a coulter seeder, a power harrow on the front of the seeder, and that levels out the field quite nicely. Say if you didn't have that, and you were seeding with something like an ironbock or a little air seeder, you could maybe run a set of discs over it just to level it out. But it just depends, you start your plowing from one side one year, the next year you probably throw it back the other way. It just depends how well it plows up, and like Harley says, your soil conditions in general. You don't want to be making cheese, but you also don't want to be making flour. You need the kind of the happy medium.
Okay. Claire, another question for you on brassicas, and this is probably something that's very relevant, and a question we often get in the springtime. How long into the new year will a brassica crop last after drilling in the autumn?
That's a good question, Mary, which I'm going to pass back to you because I haven't come across that question before. I suspect it has to do with the area, how much feed you budgeted, and then how much utilization you've had, and then also the conditions of, like, say, extreme frosts. But that's my very you're probably better to answer
Yeah.
that.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose, yeah, look, I mean, obviously it depends on how well you've utilized the crop or how much the crop has been utilized, but I probably think this question might be coming from the perspective of brassicas going to flare in late February.
Oh, yes.
I suppose by middle to end of February is when we would always advise you have grazed your brassicas, because at that point brassicas will go to flare. When they go to flare, the plant increases its production of glucosinolates, and they can be toxic to animals. So once you get to that flowering stage, we would advise that you don't, you know, you pull stock off your brassica, because as I say, it can be toxic to animals. So it's really important, I suppose, if you are growing a brassica, that you don't leave it until early February when you start grazing it, especially if you have a decent crop. And you really need to be aiming to have that grazed and gone off your farm by middle to late February. So you need to factor in, I suppose, and work out your stocking rate and your feed availability, and back calculate from that. Okay. Look, I think we've got through all the questions that have come in there this evening. I want to thank our two speakers, Claire and Harley. There's plenty of information being shared. These presentations will be shared after this evening, probably in the next day or two. We'll get the presentations back out to everyone so they can have a follow-up or look. But just to reiterate what Harley said, you know, the Germinal staff are always available at the end of the phone or end of email, whatever suits, to answer any questions you might have. More than happy to talk through the different options that might be suitable to your individual farm, because I suppose at the end of the day, it is essentially, you know, there's different options that are going to suit different farms, and sometimes to get the most appropriate advice for your farm, a one-to-one chat is the best way to go. So please do pick up the phone to your local Germinal rep, be that one of the guys or Claire here in Ireland or one of the team in the UK, and you know, we will help you out and give you the best advice we possibly can to make sure you get the most from your forage this summer and running into the autumn and winter. So with that, I'm going to thank you all for attending tonight, wishing you all a nice evening.